Good evening, everybody. I'm Steve Milner. I'm the director of the BSR. We arrange our sound levels at the back. Welcome. It's good to see so many friendly faces and some new ones too. Welcome to this evening's event, which is within the framework of the Being Human Festival. The Being Human Festival is a festival that's now at least in its second, if not more years, and I imagine will run for several more. And is a festival of the humanities that's organised by the School for Advanced Studies, the University of London, together with the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the British Academy. And given the fact that the British Academy are one of our principal funders, it's nice to be here at the British Academy doing an event within the Being Human Festival framework. This is the second of the BSR's Being Human Festivals this academic year, because a couple of weeks ago, it's more than that now, in October, I think we probably had the first, if not the second, of the complete season of Being Human events over at the British School in Rome, where we had a study afternoon of a mixture of artists with writers, practitioners, and also academics and representatives as well from the British Embassy in Rome, talking about travel writing, about migration, in a session which we entitled Journeys Without End. And Elena, Isayev, who's here this evening and is going to be one of the speakers, was also present at that event as one of the discussants, together with representatives of the British Academy themselves, in the shape of Professor Charles Tripp, who is the Vice President who's responsible for the consortium of the International Research Institutes, of which the British School in Rome is the largest member. So we're delighted to be part of the Being Human Festival. We're delighted to have this kind of twinning event in the spirit of bilateralism, which is the current watchword in terms of UK-Italian relations as we head towards the precipice of Brexit, and doing our bit to maintain those bridges and keep that connectivity in place. So today's event, which goes under the title of Origins and Endings in Italian History, we're delighted to have four speakers with us this evening. Claire Holleran from the University of Exeter, whose specific interest is in areas around the labour market in ancient Rome, about retail, demography, street life, a subject close to my own heart, and who recently edited, I think it's now out, the Wiley Blackwell Companion to the City of Rome, which was co-produced with Amanda Claridge, a long time of the parish of the British School at Rome. So we're delighted to have Claire with us, together with another colleague who I've already mentioned, Elena Isayev, who's been a long-time supporter of the BSR and was a fellow member of the faculty with me back in the day. And Elena's Professor of Ancient History and Place at the University of Exeter, and very interested in issues to do kind of trans-chronologically as well, issues to do with mobility, migration, which obviously is a burning issue, both historically but also currently in Italy, and questions to do with issues of hospitality and asylum as well, and was recently published with CUP last year, still 2017, the volume Migration, Mobility and Place in Ancient Italy, and very much takes the lead on these areas at the University of Exeter around a number of research clusters there, and we're hoping to collaborate with. We've both made bids to different organisations to try and fund a collaborative event which will bring the British School at Rome together with the Centre for British Research in the Levant at Amman and the University of Exeter to do a sort of triangulated event on the British Academy's research theme for 2019 of utopias and dystopias, but again trying to see that right across the chronological range from ancient civilizations right the way through to current issues that plague aspects of North Africa and the Middle East, and also the functionality of Western democracies as well. We've also got with us Hannah Malone from the Freie Universität in Berlin, who's a modernist and a former fellow at the BSR, whose particular research interest is in cemeteries and commemoration of the dead, and published a recent book on that subject, organised events at the British School at Rome, and the volume Architecture, Death and Nationhood, Monumental Cemeteries in 19th Century Italy, which came out recently, and has also got us particular interest in the Italian fascist investment in the ossuaries from the Great War, which is a fantastic subject, but again around this issue to do with death memorialisation. And finally, but by no means least, Emma-Jayne from the Open University, who's a lecturer in archaeology of Roman Italy, and again, mortuary practices and the treatment of the human body, organised a conference back in 2012, was it, at the British School at Rome, called Bodies of Evidence. So you can see an emerging theme in terms of commemoration, death, and the abstract for today's event entitled Origins and Endings in Italian History. So all four are going to speak in turn. We're going to start off with Claire Holleran on ancient Roman migration. And so I'd like you to welcome our speakers for this evening and thank you yourselves for coming.
Thank you. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is a project on mapping migration in Roman Iberia. So it's a project exploring population movement in Roman Spain and Portugal. And I'm doing this through the inscriptions from that region. So from Iberia, we do have a significant number of inscriptions where individuals record their origin, primarily on funerary monuments, but also on statue bases and votive offerings and so on. So when we find a funerary monument in, say, Seville, which commemorates an individual who comes from Merida, so Roman Emerita Augusta, what we can see there is a mobile individual. We can't say for certain that they permanently moved to Seville, just that they died there, but we can see that that person is mobile.
And the motivation for mapping this data in this way is really to visualise it in a different way, and so hopefully enable some closer analysis, because at an individual level, the information that we're looking at is very specific, but when we look at it as a whole, we can learn much more and we can identify patterns of movement and so on. So what I want to do today is have a quick look at the prototype of the map, which is being developed at the moment. So really just to demonstrate the concept and to show you what I'm hoping to achieve. And then to take you through some examples of the inscriptions that I'm working with and to talk about the different ways in which people express their origins and what that might mean. So the map at the moment is fairly basic. The development team are working on it. It should look totally different in about 6 weeks' time, so I'm told. In particular, there's no interface at the moment, and we've only got a few migrants loaded on as test cases. But I hope you can see how some of the functionality is developing. And it's an ideal opportunity for me as well, because it's at the developmental stage. If any of you have any thoughts on how we can display this data, then I would love to hear them in the Q&A afterwards. So here it is in very, very basic form at the moment. So migrant journeys are expressed simply as lines. So we've just got a few migrant journeys on there at the moment. We're still developing ideas about how best to display this. At the moment, if you click on a migrant destination, what will come up in the side is the number of migrants who've left that place and the number of migrants who've arrived at that place. So this is just one example from Caesar in Lusitania. At the moment, it doesn't tell you where they're from or how far they've moved. That data comes when you click on the actual line itself. So here we've got one migrant who's moved from Segisamo in Tarraconensis to Caesar in Lusitania. So we can see that that is migration between provinces. So Iberia is divided into 3 provinces by Augustus. So we've got Tarraconensis, Lusitania, and Boetica. So we can see here people moving between them. And it gives us a distance, so 280 kilometres. And we're still working on the best way to display that sort of information about the individual journeys. One of the other things you'll be able to do is turn on and off different layers. So there's a variety of layers taken from a different number of data sources here. So from the Digital Atlas of the Roman Empire, from Pelagios, from Pleiades, and from the Oxford Roman Economy project. So we've got things like a detailed road layer. So you can see the layers as they are at the moment, just listed up there. So we've got road layers, places, provinces, military, mines, and quarries. So, for example, if we turn on the layers of provinces and places, that helps us think about how far people are moving between provinces. So is movement largely within a province, or are people actually moving between provinces? Also, are they coming from outside or into Iberia? And so on. We can also add in the road data. So because at the moment we have migrant journeys as straight lines, which of course they weren't in reality. But once we map these, we can think about how the topography of a region might impact on that movement. So we can replot migrant journeys along major roads. And we can think about the influence, if any, that the road network might have on population movement. So are people mainly moving along road networks? Or actually is the river network more important? Or coastal journeys, are they more important? And we can also think about natural topography. So we might have two places that are close together, but we don't see much movement between them. That might well be because there's a mountain range between them. This all becomes much more obvious when you look at it on a map. I also want to think a bit about the motivation for movement, which in a sense ties into my interests in things like labour markets. So for example, if we turn on mines and quarries, can we see that people are frequently moving to areas with mines or quarries? So can we see some kind of economic migration, so labour mobility there? So at the moment you can turn on mine and quarry data, and if you click on an individual mine or quarry, it tells you what's being mined there, or what's being quarried there. But it also gives you details of migrants within a particular proximity. So at the moment it's set to 25 kilometres, but you can adjust that. So here we've got an example of a lead and silver mine. We've got 3 migrants within 25 kilometres, so possibly testifying here to some labour migration. We can also turn on a layer of civilian military settlements and think about whether are we just seeing soldiers going to military settlements, or can we also see civilians? So again, are people perhaps attracted there by the economic opportunities offered by a military settlement, or are they pulled by social ties? We can also think about whether people typically move from, say, poorer arable areas to richer agricultural areas, or from smaller to larger urban centres. And also by mapping this, we can see things like chain migration more clearly. So are we seeing groups of people moving from one place to another? So patterns of movement become much more easy to visualise when we put this on a map. And eventually the map will also be linked to a database containing information about the people who moved. So there'll be a series of migrant records as well. And that will include details such as the individual's legal status. So were they freeborn, slave or freed slaves? Their sex and age. So can we identify female migration, family migration, or actually does that long-held paradigm of the single adult male migrant hold for this material as well? Can we find any information about their social status or occupation? Is it primarily soldiers or administrators who are moving? Is it traders? So I'm thinking both about the journeys and the individuals who took them. So this is the way that, at the moment, I'm hoping to display the data. I'd like to take you through some of the inscriptions themselves now, talk a little bit about the data itself. Now, most of my inscriptions are taken from the Hispania Epigraphica online database. And it's worth saying at the start that all of this is very much subject to the habits of epigraphic recording and survival. So it's not actually the norm to record a specific origin on your tombstone. There's around 500 examples of this on the Hispania Epigraphica database, which is a decent number, but it's only about 3% of the entire inscriptions that are catalogued here. And about 150 of those instances occur when people record their origin within their own community. So it's not something that you just do when you move. Perhaps for those people it's a way of emphasising their possession of local citizenship or their local attachments. We don't really know why people necessarily do it in their own area. It is much more common among people who move. So, as I said earlier, about 350 or so examples relate to people who've moved away from their place of origin. So perhaps for them it's acting as a marker of identity or an expression of civic pride for those who are far from home. So it's not typical, but there's certainly enough data here to work with. An individual can express their origin in a number of ways. The most common way is just by using the adjectival form of a city, so typically after the name. So here we have Licinia Materna, daughter of Paternus. She describes herself as being Nova Augustana, so of Nova Augusta, 30 years old. Hic Sita est, so here she lies, sit tibi terra levis, may the earth rest lightly upon you, which is a phrase that we see quite frequently in the Spanish material. Now it's a female migrant we've got here, a relatively young female migrant. There's no mention of a family here, so we don't know who has commemorated her. She doesn't mention a husband or a father or any children here. Doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it could perhaps point to some single female migration. She's ended up over 5,000 kilometres away from where she started, up in Nova Augusta. Now, she didn't necessarily make this journey all in one go, of course. We just know that she started off there and she died in Rio Tinto. Rio Tinto is an important mining region, so possibly she was drawn here by the economic opportunities of this community. There's another example here. This is Gaius Camillus Paternus of the Galeria tribe. That's his voting tribe, not his ethnic tribe. So that tells us that he's a Roman citizen. And he's from Clunia. And the reason I've included him is because we do have a significant number of the database who are from Clunia. So about 10% of the migrants that I'm looking at come from Clunia, and that's the largest single group from any one location. That doesn't particularly mean that Clunians are more likely to move. I mean, it could be that at some point there's some economic or social crisis which pushes people away from Clunia. It could also just be that people from Clunia, for some reason, are more likely to tell you that they're from Clunia. But we do get these clusters. And here, Gaius Camillus Paternus has moved from Clunia to close to Capua in Lusitania. So again, moved across provinces. And there's about 8 other Clunians in close proximity to him there, which is interesting when we think about who's put this up, because this apparently was put up by the Vicinia Cluniensum, so the neighbourhood association of Clunians. So if that's the correct reading of this, I mean, some have thought that Vicinia is a name, and it means Vicinia, slave of Clunia, but it's more likely to mean neighbourhood here. If that's the correct reading, what we do have is a semi-formal association of migrants, possibly facilitating migration from Clunia to that region, or at the very least, supporting those who've arrived. So a semi-formal group of migrants in this region. Sometimes we see people use the term domo in conjunction with a place name, which roughly translates as with his or her home at. But that again refers to their place of origin. So this here is Marcus Cellius Honoratus, son of Lucius of the Onensis tribe. So again, that's his voting tribe, so we know he's a citizen. It says he's got his home at Choba, which is in Mauritania, in North Africa. He's an equestrian prefect of the 2nd Flavia Hispanorum, which is a cavalry unit based at Petavonium in Spain. It's not a funerary marker this time. This is a dedication to Hercules. So he didn't die here, probably moved on somewhere else afterwards. But it's a clear example of military movement. And he's moved over 1,000 kilometres from North Africa to Petavonium there. Now there's other ways of denoting origin that are a bit less straightforward to interpret. So one thing we do get in the Iberian material, particularly in later antiquity, is people using the term natio, which in Latin just means sort of birth or tribe, a kind, a people. Now when people use the term natio, it's not always clear if we're looking at a specific geographical origin for an individual or an expression of ethnicity or ethnic descent. So for example, we have here an anonymous gladiator, so it's a fragmentary inscription, we've lost the name, but we know they're a hoplomachus, which is a type of gladiator, of 20 victories. Now they describe themselves as being Natione Bessus, so from the people of the Bessi, which is a tribal region basically in Thrace. So from the Bessie and Thrace, commemorated in Cadiz, so almost 3,000 kilometres away. This is set up by his wife, Benny Morente, well deserving. What we don't know here is if he's actually from there, geographically, or actually if this is just an ethnic descent, he's from that people. So at some point somebody's moved, but we don't know when. Occasionally it's a little bit clear when people use natio because they will refer to a specific city. So here we've got Julia Glyconis, who describes herself as being, or is described, it's a funerary monument put up by her sons, who describe her as being Natione Nicomedica, which probably means from Nicomedia in Bithynia. So again, 3,000 miles away in modern-day Turkey. And she's commemorated in Merida, in Augusta Emerita in Spain. Sometimes we just get the term natio to refer to a kind of area. So Natione Germanus here that we have with this gladiator again. This is Probus, who fought 99 times of the people of Germania. And this is put up by his wife and by his son. What we don't know here is if Probus is being described as being of Germanic descent, so is he from the German peoples, or is he specifically from one of the provinces? Is he from Germania Inferior or Germania Superior? So again, it testifies to some sort of human mobility, but we're not quite sure who moved and when. And the final one I'd just like to show you here is a late antique example, I think, which shows the complexity of origins and identity in some of this material. This is from the 4th century, and we get mixing here of sort of traditional Roman epitaphs and Christian ideas. So it starts off dis manibus, which is the traditional Roman way of starting an epitaph, and it ends with recessit fidelis in pace, so rest faithful in peace, which is a Christian idea. So we've got those two identities being mixed together here. And it's Aurelius Aeliodorus, who describes himself as being Natione Graeci, so of the people of Greece. He's a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia. He's spent some time in Hispalis, which is Seville, and he's commemorated in Tarragona, or Roman Tarraco, and he's more or less 80 years. So you can see here that identity, particularly in late antiquity, can become a little bit difficult. Sometimes we also get people whose name suggests they might be from a particular area, but we don't know for sure. So here we've got two people whose names derive from the name of a tribe. So Lucius Pompeius Rufus Limicus and Lucius Calpurnius Fagetis Limicus, probably somehow associated with the Limici tribe. But what we don't know again is whether those names were given to them after they moved. Did they take them on themselves to just identify with that tribe, or were they given them at birth with the intention of reflecting a family's historic links to a particular location? So occasionally we do have problems with this material. In the vast majority of cases, it's straightforward. When people give their origin, it's basically where they're from. But because some of the examples are less clear, on the database it will be possible to filter out. So the method of denoting origin is clearly displayed. So if you don't want to use onomastics, you can actually take those out of the sample. So the final thing I'd just like to say is that this is a project in its own right, so I am just looking at Spain at the moment, but it's intended to be a test project for seeing if this is possible to extend to the Roman Empire as a whole, to get a fuller picture of population movement across the Roman world. So that's why, if anybody does have any ideas about how this could be displayed, it'd be great to hear it now while it's at the developmental stage. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much for that, Claire. That's absolutely perfect because I'm not talking about anybody specifically. So what I hope to do is to give you some of the kind of bigger thought world, I suppose, that some of Claire's characters moved around in. I mean, she didn't present them as characters, these are real people. Mostly what I'd be talking about is more characters than anything else, so that fits perfectly. And also, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to work with the British School at Rome, precisely because it is a point of encounter. I wouldn't be doing 90% what I do now if I hadn't spent some time at the British School at Rome, and not just talking to the wonderful scholars that are there, but also to the whole variety of other people who are artists, architects, archaeologists, and just people who live in the area. But today I'm going to start with the young poet who lived some 2,000 years ago, who captured the paradox of the journey and the eagerness for its beginning and its end. So I've taken it quite literally, the origins and endings theme. Now my mind trembling in anticipation longs to roam. Now happy in their zeal, my feet grow strong. O sweet band of comrades, fare you well, whom having set out all at once far from home, diverse routes bear back in varied ways. So the Latin poet Catullus, here writing of Asia Minor, modern Turkey of today, captured the anticipation and the thrill of setting out on a journey, and yet it is tinged with longing for his companions, and the return home, whether real or imagined, and that also which is left behind, or perhaps even lost. It also signals a bit the unknowing of what will come to pass, and expectations of the time and space that is traversed. So the transformations, especially within oneself. Well, whether it is with zeal or trepidation that journeys are begun, the endings are uncertain, and that is perhaps the one thing that these both have in common. One of the things I've been starting to look at is the way that each period through time has a different way of using journey stories, trying to understand how we think about the then and also how we think about the now. So of course Homer is the one everybody turns to when thinking about journey stories, one of the oldest ones in the Mediterranean, but definitely not the oldest one by far. And what he is doing is kind of winding his long way home. And he goes across many shores, meets many hosts. And what most of his hosts want to know is whether the people that hosted him before were friendly or hostile to strangers. And you will know what the Cyclops in the cave, who does all sorts of supposedly very wrong things in terms of hosting, not least by eating the guests rather than feeding them. Never do that. But if we look very closely at that story, the guests themselves are found wanting. And when they enter the cave, this is something not really talked about, what they're doing is actually stealing. So they are much more like raiders than what we'd think of as guests. So these kind of epics, particularly of Homer, provided a laboratory for Jacques Derrida to test the extremes of hospitality, or xenia as it's called in ancient Greek. Derrida, using Homer, questioned the very existence of that kind of hospitality in light of the impossibility of it being unconditional. So in Homer's polis, on pre-polis, I should say, face-to-face society of elite warriors, any asylum requests or any unknown stranger would go to the threshold, or at least that is the way it is portrayed. And it is the householder who would decide whether to let the person in or not, whether to offer xenia. But some 300 years after Homer wrote down the epics, in the world of the polis, the city-state, that of the democracy or the beginnings of democracy in Athens, obligations to those who are unknown strangers who seek refuge become a lot less clear. And that might be encompassed in the question of, well, who is the host in the city? So the threshold is no longer at the door of your house, but it is the city. But where is the threshold of a city? And this kind of question, oops, oh, I see the problem. It doesn't change on this. That's okay. That's fine. Is revealed in such tragedies as Aeschylus' suppliant women. And here you see, doing it again. And here you see a couple of the images from the production, one in Sicily and one that took place in London at the Young Vic last year. What they are interested in, these Greek tragedians, is using these moments of hospitality of the unknown stranger at the door to actually talk about democracy itself. So where is morality and responsibility? Where is the balance of power between the state and the individual? So where's the true place of decision-making? Is it with the people or the king? Who needs to decide about whether to let these people in, and what is the threshold? So, in other words, they are a way to gauge society, a way to gauge who are the real representatives of the common will. I'm going to take a couple more journeys and then go on to think about some of the bigger frameworks within which these happen. If we take another generation or so after these plays were performed, so in the 4th century BC, nope, not yet. In the Hellenistic period, we have Apollonius of Rhodes writing about Jason and the Argonauts as they travel around the Mediterranean and beyond in their ship, the Argo. And what they do, it's about revealing what is the new Hellenistic world for them, at the center of which is no longer Athens and Sparta, but in fact the jewel of the North Africa, which is Alexandria. And also in this period of large mercenary armies, there's a shift, it seems to be, from the good host to the good guest, and much more of an interest there as to what makes the good guest. So if we skip a millennia ahead, now you can have this picture, and you're wondering why that is there. This is Carl Linnaeus, some of you might be familiar with him. London actually has the Linnaean Society and holds the majority of the archives that were produced by him. Why have I put this on? Well, because in 1732, Carl Linnaeus made a journey into Lapland. And this was at the base of his later composition of the Systema Natura. And the knowledge that emerged was created in transit on this 6 months journey and depended highly on encounters of people he met there, not least the so-called indigenous people of the Sami, as well as the frameworks of the hospitality and hostility that he encountered there. So like the Argonauts, what Linnaeus was doing is retracing his own world like an explorer. And what he did, he made the familiar into something that was exotic and distant. So he populated Lapland with myths of the ancient world, making it magical. So where furies, like the one you see there, roam the bogs, he actually writes that one of the people he met was like a fury. And you might as well be reading Ovid here in Lapland. But the second the woman speaks, this fury turns into a person who's actually very hospitable, and then the myth falls away. But then he creates new myths of Lapland, which you still live with today, the land of the herding reindeer, where they're much, much more than that. And one of the projects we're doing at the moment is how to read that diary as, if you'd like, an archive against the grain to bring in these other voices. When Linnaeus is writing this, he's of course writing it against the landscape of colonialism and also the extraction of natural resources, which perhaps appear a lot less mythical in some ways. So at the base of my investigation very much lies the question of what is the journey story of today? Or is it that we reject or deny this journey story? Not because it's not powerful, but because perhaps it exposes something uncomfortable and may reveal us as other as to what we think we are in the 21st century. And this might be captured in asking the simple question of who is on the journey. So for example, is Catullus or any of his band of comrades actually migrants? What would that term even mean 2,000 years ago? Well, we might say, no, he's a traveler, somebody who will return home. But his poem doesn't actually say that, and there might be questions as to where he will return. Catullus may have stayed, as many did from Italy, in Asia Minor, so modern Turkey. A land also made magical and distant, yet fully well known, and populated by those he knew or knew about. It was home of Herodotus, who surveyed the world from one of its enticing cosmopolitan hubs of trade, culture, and knowledge. So to call Catullus, in his own time, a migrant would be meaningless. As in his world, the struggle that we have is actually finding any generic term that would mean the same thing, well, at least not in Latin before the late imperial period. So we have lots of terms for people who are outsiders. Hospes, somebody who might be given hospitality, or hostis, the enemy. A peregrinus, perhaps is the most common term used to denote somebody from elsewhere. The other word we get very commonly used, which we don't really come across today, is alienus or ignotus, which means unknown. So the important thing was less that you were from the outside, but that you were unknown. And often these labels that I've just given you describe those who are newly arrived in the city, and they focus on that specific relationship of the individual to the host community. The closest we actually get in Latin to migrant is a term that arrives in late Roman period or early medieval, is a term called transitor, literally meaning he who goes over or is a passerby. So it appears at a time when immobility starts to be associated with virtue. It doesn't mean that there was more immobility, but the way it was perceived is to be immobile, is to have some kind of, not just virtuosity, but you have an option to not move. So categorizing someone as transitor in the same way as migrant today implies a negative state and was then associated with vagrancy. So it reflects a shifting attitude not just to mobility, but also status of individuals and methods of control. In 2015, before the Brexit vote, the journalist David Marsh asked, what do the following people have in common? Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, the former England cricketer Kevin Peterson, and Nigel Farage's wife, Kirsten. Anybody know what they all have in common? Yes, they are all technically migrants because they're subject to immigration control. But of course, nobody would really call them that. And they definitely didn't now. So when that question, if that was asked in 2015, I wouldn't have gotten such a chorus. But this term is reserved by politicians and media to describe people who, unlike bankers and sports stars, they don't like. So people from the UK moving abroad to pursue careers and financial interests or to retire are either expats or perhaps visitors, but never emigrants or migrants. But perhaps if we do go through Brexit, they will become migrants, but not called that by themselves. So similarly to migrant, the term migration is not neutral. And its meaning today is different from its ancient Latin form migrare, which was much more fluid. The Latin Republican usage didn't differentiate between moving to a different state or community, nor was the motion a single event in one direction. In the comedies of Plautus, I don't know why it's doing this. In the comedies of Plautus, we get a whole series of, if you like, derivations of migrare, and the most common one is co-migrare, meaning kind of to move with one's things. So what it's about is moving with one's family and belongings to spend longer somewhere else, so selling up the house. But the same kind of movement was also covered by emigrare and migrare in the texts. There is a point where Plautus uses a term called remigrare, which we don't have other occurrences of, and this is very jokey. So he's gone on a tangent, and what he's doing is migrating back to what he's meant to be telling you about. So this kind of playfulness with the terminology of mobility, which we can see, suggests an increasing interest in defining different forms of movement and also categorizing that movement from abroad. Just at the time that Rome was beginning to gain an empire and many new people were coming into the city, while many of those from the city were very visibly going abroad. Not that they weren't before, but now perhaps much more visibly. And the Plautine characters, they dart around the Mediterranean, as you can see here in just 3 of the plays. These are some of the places they've gone to. So they go all the way from India, all the way down to Carthage. Or not down, but across to Carthage. And that's not just something that appears in his comedies. We know from other ancient historians writing at the time that there were tens of thousands of people living in the 1st century BC who were of Italian background or origin in Asia Minor, modern Turkey. We know this in part because Mithridates in 88 BC is supposed to have massacred 80,000 Italians who were living there at the time. Now, no epigraphic evidence would have ever suggested that more than a handful of Italian origin people were living in this place. So it's the same way that Claire was giving you warnings about what kind of questions we can ask from this data, that is really important because we would never get to anything even close to 8,000, never mind 80,000, living in Asia Minor at that time who had come from Italy. So if we just return to Plautus and his audience, what we can see is that mobility was not something outside the norm, but very much part of the everyday. And some demographic figures would suggest that it's a possibility that in the last 200 years BC, the total number of movements through Italy might have been as high as 40 million. And that's to give you a bit of context. In Italy, the size probably of about 8 million population to 10 million population at the time. We also have other diverse forms of evidence, both epigraphic, but also from stable isotope analysis and census data that suggest that perhaps a third of any community would have been from the outside. And one of the things that I would like to test, this will take many years, with various scientists and historians working on it, is whether that figure of a third is something that's quite stable both across time and across different places. There's a lot of wonderful stable isotope analysis being developed now, and I'm happy to talk about that at either Q&A over wine, which would really help us to be able to gauge that. So Plautus is living at a time where there are no physical borders. There are no nation states, nor are there maps like this. He would have never imagined his journeys are mapped like this. We don't have maps to scale or regional maps to scale at a time. We don't have them really until the finding of the so-called New World, when they start to be developed. And that's really saying something, because it's about how you picture where you are. So you're not moving across a territory when you're moving in ancient Italy. What you're doing is you're moving across a landscape. You're moving, the way you would see the world is very much at eye level. So the roads that move away from you. And what you've got here is just a whole variety of bits of kind of counter-cartographic, pre-cartographic examples. This is the one that was most like a map, the 4th century AD, although we only have it in medieval copies. And also some examples of, oh, no, that was my fault. Okay, I don't know what to press here, never mind. The one on the top corner is the Nile mosaic, which is seen also as a kind of cartographic type image. Okay, so migrate, I hope I've shown you, means something other than what we're used to today. And I'm just going to have a little, very brief kind of run through how we got to understanding migrate as we understand it today. So migration, meaning to move across an international border in a permanent way with the purpose of residence, is actually very recent, and we could date it to about the 18th century in the context of North America. And the novelty of the term was noted by the philologist John Pickering, who might be the John Pickering of My Fair Lady, and he included to immigrate, immigration, and immigrant as neologisms or new terms in his 1816 work, which, as you can see here, is called A Vocabulary or Collection of Words and Phrases which have been supposed to be peculiar to the United States of America. Now, by 1828, that word was much less peculiar and was included in Webster's and American Dictionary of the English Language. And what it did, the definition, is it made space, time, and purpose fundamental to the characteristics of migration. And this kind of new social construction, which required kind of a focus on permanent residence, so you had to know where you're going with the intent of permanently settling there, led to encouraged a fear of displacement by the people who had lived there to begin with. So the new arrivals at the time were mainly coming from Germany, and you have these kind of images, which if you've seen any of the Farages, the fear of the crowd that's coming to attack, they're very much like this kind of style. So that fear comes out of this particular context, and not something that is the norm across periods. With this new formation, which is post-Westphalia, so 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia that created the nation states, we also then eventually got the passport. But that is also very new. So Reuben Fink wrote in The Nation, a journal you might know from the United States, that in 1921, he wrote on an article entitled Visas, Immigration, and Official Anti-Semitism. The passport and visa system is one of the evil heritages of the Great War. It emerged as a natural corollary of war logic, and in this country it had its birth on May 22nd, 1918, through the adoption by Congress of the so-called Passport Control Act. It provided that no one should leave the United States without a passport or a permit from the Department of State, or enter this country without a passport properly visaed by the American consul or other accredited representatives abroad. The term of this act was to expire with a declaration of peace. So here we ask ourselves, are we then still at war, if that is the case? In other words, we've had nations before without any conception of the passport or the visa system, so it's not just that nation can be imagined differently, it has been practiced differently. This is what Paul McGee wrote in our joint article with Arif Husseini, which was entitled The Sky is Hidden, on the opening up of language and national borders. So today's conception of migration arising out of a very specific historical context has been projected into the past as the norm, wrongly, where it assumes that territory, citizenship, and belonging all converge, which they don't necessarily. What we don't have from at least the Republican period and very few ancient contexts is the expulsion of people specifically because they were foreign.
People, we don't have checkpoints at walls, which is fortification walls, which seems very strange, until quite a late period, like we get in Constantinople. So what things are checked are goods rather than people, or people like slaves if they are goods. So it's about economy rather than vetting somebody simply because they're from the outside. And here is a statement from Cicero's De Officiis on duties, where he writes, "They do wrong those who would debar foreigners from our cities and would drive them out, as was done by Penice in the time of our fathers, and recently by Papias. Of course, it's right not to permit the right of citizenship to one who is not a citizen. Still, to debar foreigners from using the city is clearly inhuman." Now, you might say, okay, but he's still stopping people from coming in. But what this is all about, it's not a xenophobic act, but a political act. So a couple of politicians, including Caesar, want there to be more citizens and want to give these people citizenship so they can have more clients who would vote for them. And it is their opponents in politics who want to stop this from happening. So the preoccupation with limiting migration and measuring human flows is very much a modern phenomenon. And Betts and Collier, who write in their book Refuge, not an uncontroversial book, published as recently as 2017, that the current crisis isn't one of numbers but of politics. And Joseph Cairns, in his book Ethics of Immigration, actually asked the question, why should democratic states take in refugees at all? Of course, he wrote that in 2013. One of the things he does is he outlines a disparity between certain places that take in a lot of people and others that don't, and says that we shouldn't romanticize or celebrate the ones that do, partly because if they cared more about their citizens, they wouldn't necessarily let so many outsiders in. This is a very controversial way of thinking about why people are let in. And those are my words, not his words. And of course, he was writing before Lebanon now has a population, about 40% of whom are refugees or asylum seekers. Now, to give you a comparison, in 2015, Europe took in 1 million, which is 0.2% of the European population. So just to end, to present the situation of this in this kind of a way suggests a kind of amnesia. First of all, that it was not so long ago that Europeans were fleeing the ravages of World War II. In some, as the parents of the theater director Stefan Kegi found refuge in Morocco. And secondly, forgetfulness as to why people leave on such journeys, if that is what they are. I'm going to end with this poem from the Kenyan-born Somali poet Warsan Shire, which some of you actually may know. It's called Home. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. No one burns their palms and trains beneath carriages. No one spends days and nights in the stomach of a truck feeding on newspaper unless the miles traveled means something more than journey. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm quite small, so I'm just going to stand to the side here. I hope that's okay. So our theme for this evening is origins and endings. Now, this might make you think that everything has an obvious start and an eventual end point. But what particularly interests me, and that's already doing it, what particularly interests me is the relationship between something old and something new. So the processes whereby one thing becomes another. And I think this is best exemplified for the ancient Roman world, not by major political events like the fall of the Republic and the emergence of empire, but in the personal practices of ordinary people, and especially their responses to another very human, very clear ending, that of death. Death is an ending, but it's also the beginning of a new set of relationships between those who are still alive and those who have died. Relationships that are played out for the first time in the arena of the funeral, or more specifically, the way in which the dead are disposed of. But of course, the practices that this process of disposal entailed also had their own origins and endings, perhaps seen best from around the late 1st, early 2nd century CE, when many Romans ended the several centuries old tradition of cremating the dead and began to inhume them. So I thought we'd take a look at this shift in more detail, not necessarily with the intention of explaining the end of one practice and the start of another, but in terms of understanding how the inhumed body was treated and whether this might reflect or create new relationships between the living and the dead. So, as I said, this is basic diagram to explain it. During the 1st and early 2nd century CE, the standard Roman mortuary rite of cremation was largely abandoned in favour of inhumation. And this is a shift that's been described as the biggest single event in ancient burial. Explanations for it have ranged from changing religious beliefs and the rise of so-called mystery cults to fashion and new forms of ostentatious display that might be offered by elaborate marble sarcophagi. Very little attention has been paid to the possibility that this change might be related to ideas about the human body. But at their most basic level, cremation and inhumation do involve fundamentally different ways of treating the body. Cremation brings about a very violent destruction of the corpse, whereas inhumation maintains its integrity for longer. They each involve distinct choices, and it's hard to imagine that the people of Roman Italy didn't recognise that. Now, it might seem that to supplant cremation with inhumation is to simply stop processing the body with fire and to begin disposing of entire bodies, but of course it's not that straightforward. Not only does inhumation remove the often complex rites that surrounded the burning of a body, so the spectacle of the pyre, placing the body on it, opening the eyes, ritual lighting and extinguishing of the flames, collection of the remains, their deposition and so forth. But the corporeal remains deposited in the ground, sarcophagus or tomb, are also treated differently. Inhumation may, at first glance, seem a far simpler process, but we can't assume that it involved any kind of reduced level of bodily preparation or ritual. Questions to be addressed for those responsible for an inhumation burial might include what the body is to be buried in, if anything. So an earthen grave, perhaps with or without a tile cover, a coffin, an amphora, a sarcophagus, a tomb, a catacomb. Will it be dressed? Will it be adorned or wrapped in a shroud? How will it be laid out? Will it be crouched, extended, prone, or supine? How will the limbs be arranged? What will accompany it? And where will they be placed in relation to the body? What will the body be embalmed or treated in any way prior to its burial? And all of these actions distinguish the act of inhumation from cremation and require that those responsible for the burial come into contact with and experience the materiality of the corpse in its entirety. As a result, they can direct the nature of the relationships between the living and the dead. So maybe then, the new relationships that inhumation offered were especially relevant at this time, which was also right at a moment when the upper classes and those who could afford the services of professional undertakers were beginning to readdress their relationship with the dead body anyway. As professionals started to become the norm, mourners became distanced from the corpse itself, leaving its direct physical manipulation to others. So by considering what bodily treatment really entailed in instances of inhumation, we might get closer to examining some of the nuances in this shift in practice. Now, ancient sources have very little to say about activities associated specifically with the inhuming of bodies. So in order to examine the treatment of the body in these instances, we have to turn to the evidence for the bodies in the ground. And one of the most noticeable aspects of the archaeological evidence for inhumation across Italy during the imperial period concerns the degree of protection that is offered for the body. So some were interred in existing monumental tombs that had originally been designed to hold cremation urns, but were subsequently modified to make space for whole bodies. Others were placed in new structures built specifically to house inhumations. Leaving these aside, inhumation burials, like cremation burials, have also been found in very large numbers from the spaces between tombs at sites such as Isola Sacra, Sarsana, Alba, and at the many necropolis sites around Rome, such as the Via Triumphalis, the Via Colentina, and as well from cemetery sites that have relatively few monumental structures, such as Gubbio and Ravenna, which are sites I'll mention a little bit later. So this gives you an impression of quite how packed in all these bodies might be. Here they are placed in between tombs, and there they're just spread out across the cemetery. Now, in many ways, these graves represent inhumation in its purest form, as described here by Varro. They also provide a glimpse of what was considered important in terms of the body itself. Indeed, what's striking about many of these graves is that although they appear quite modest in comparison with monumental tombs, their form reflects a considerable focus on the protection of the body, with excavation frequently revealing evidence for some sort of container into which the corpse was placed or a structure that was built around or over the body. And these include wooden coffins, wooden boards that are placed flat across the grave, undecorated terracotta sarcophagi, tiles or stones that might be laid flat over the grave, or alla cappuccino, where they're raised up into a sort of gabled roof. Tiles might be used to line the sides of the grave, creating sort of in situ sort of coffin. Fragments of amphorae and other pottery might be used to cover the body. And usually, in the case of infants, we might find them inserted directly into an intact amphora. Now, these structures, and there's just some examples you can see here, are largely subterranean in nature. They're invisible on the surface, so their primary function was clearly related to the body with which they were associated. They're not part of a wider range of a sort of typology of commemoration. And into this category fall also the cassone, or these barrel-shaped masonry structures, which represent very small, above-ground monumental structures. Now, many of the ones at Isola Sacra, which you can see here, were already built over these tile cappuccino graves. And at Ravenna, on the northeast coast of Italy, many were found to mark graves containing wooden coffins. Indeed, in several cases, a body might be provided with more than one layer of protection. So coffins or terracotta sarcophagi might be interred beneath a cappuccina, sometimes with a cassone above it. So why go to such lengths to protect the corpse once it had been deposited? There was certainly a degree of fear about the souls of the unburied dead who might rise up and terrorise the living, as evidenced by a number of contemporary ghost stories. But these fears were largely put to rest by casting a token handful of earth over the buried remains. There's no written evidence for any particularly heightened fears of the undead during this period, nor is there any archaeological evidence to suggest that these bodies themselves were feared. They're not being held down in the grave with large stones or anything like that. Indeed, most were provided with libation tubes, which provided direct access to the world of the living, and this one is my favourite of all time. This discovery in the necropolis of Castellaccio is a female skeleton with her hand, her forearm, stretching up the libation tube to take the offering directly as it was poured down it. I think that was probably the case, barring the unlikely event that she was actually buried alive. I think it suggests that it was very important to maintain a very direct relationship between the living and the dead. So if the intention was to bury the dead in order to stop them rising, it seems very odd that the living would provide such an obvious escape route for them. So it also seems improbable that these subterranean structures were designed to prevent accidental or intentional desecration of the grave either, because there was no... an above-ground marker, would be a much better way of preventing accidental disturbance. So if not fear of the undead or disturbance by the living, then perhaps the body itself had gained a new significance. These Roman communities had not just begun to bury entire bodies, they were taking care to ensure adequate, sometimes more than adequate protection for them. So we also find, for example, use of wooden coffins, and I apologise for the quality of these images, but you should get the idea. Relatively few complete coffins survive. A small number came from Isola Sacra, just outside Rome, and sometimes they're attested by multiple nails that are found around the side of graves that might indicate that once there had been a coffin. But excavations at Ravenna produced large numbers of well-preserved coffins. And they actually revealed that nails and other metal fittings were often used quite sparingly. In many cases, the boards of the coffins were joined using wooden pegs. So that means that coffins may have been used at other sites when there were no iron nails recovered. And that's supported by other recent evidence from around the suburbs of Rome, where anthropological studies have revealed that 90% of inhumed bodies underwent decomposition in a void. So that suggests that the earth was somehow held away from the body. Some, such as a well-preserved skeleton in a mausoleum in the Via Collatina necropolis, seem to be simply left in open spaces that may have been the result of coffins. Others, including another example from a grave within the same mausoleum, show similar signs of decomposition in a void, but also demonstrates evidence perhaps for the use of a shroud or wrappings. So both of these bodies benefited from the protection of the mausoleum structure they were buried in, but they were both protected further by gabled structures that were constructed with flakes of 2-foot brick and tile over the possible coffin or the shroud. So it seems that the integrity or the safety of the corpse has gained a high level of priority. They're not only protecting these bodies from violation, but they're actually protecting it from the earth itself. And in addition, coffins and indeed shrouds, for which there is some evidence, are both capable of hiding the essential materialness of the dead body, at the same time as drawing attention to its presence and stressing its newly peculiar character. In fact, if you think about it, concealing the body could actually bring its nature to the fore by signalling that there was something to hide, in a way that again contrasts with cremation practice. Cremation in ancient Rome was about making the corpse either visually or sensorially into a recognizable object from which the living could separate during the cremation ceremony. Inhumation, on the other hand, appears to have centered less on an objectified corpse and more on the body that it had been when it was still animated by the living subject. Knowledge of its dynamic materiality persisted, but the living appeared to have been concerned with allowing the body to retain its original identity, whilst making attempts to conceal the transformations that it's undergoing, and certainly not hastening them by, through the violence of cremation. And significantly, I think we can expect this to have brought about different embodied experiences of the funeral. So in instances of cremation, the body dressed in its finery was on display. Exposure of the body, even if heavily anointed and perfumed to mask the scent of decay and powdered to colour the discoloration of death, evoked particular embodied memories, emotions and experience for mourners and onlookers. If the body is hidden in a coffin or beneath a shroud, the impact on everyone concerned would have been very different. This would alter the relationship between the bereaved and the corpse, given that its putrefaction, which was previously masked with perfumes but not completely hidden, was concealed still further. The body may no longer have decayed visibly in public as it lay in state, but that didn't mean that those who encountered the coffin were not aware of what was happening inside, meaning that the coffin or the shroud itself drew attention to the dynamic nature of the body by visibly highlighting this new need to conceal it and the transformations it's undergoing. Perhaps this was a further way of denying the realities of decay. By removing the corpse from view, the coffin enabled mourners to perform the traditional rites, including allowing it to lie in state, but made it possible to maintain a distance from it. And when a coffin, rather than a visible corpse, was moved through the streets of the city during the funerary procession, death and the family could continue to still be on display in the traditional manner, but the body was not. Nevertheless, onlookers and those involved in the procession would have been aware of the contents of the box or what lay beneath the shroud. So neither really completely concealed it. Instead, they drew greater attention to it by inviting onlookers to speculate on what was inside, what it looked like, what it felt like, what it smelt like, and to associate it with their own experiences of death. This anonymous body then may have facilitated this more efficiently, allowing people to sort of abstract these emotions and experiences without them being tied to the particular identity of the body in front of them. So a shrouded body would still have resembled the human form, even though its identity remained hidden, encouraging onlookers to confront and contemplate the corpse whilst it's remaining concealed. So in this way, the shroud and the coffin concealed the reality of death whilst also drawing carefully managed attention to it. So the body was both present and absent, both visible and invisible. But we might ask why the need to do this now and not before? Well, the changes brought about by the use of funerary professionals and the distance that I think that had established between the bodies of living mourners and the deceased might be significant here. Once the compulsion to come into direct contact with the corpse was removed, Roman families may have become increasingly reluctant to deal with its decaying corporeal reality. And this feeling may have been reinforced by the undertakers themselves, who were widely considered to be polluted by their profession and were socially stigmatized. As these professionals became frequent actors in the funeral, mourners may have become increasingly less eager to associate themselves with the activities performed by polluted social outcasts, removing themselves still further from the now sordid corpse, seeing it as the domain of the undertaker and not of the family, keeping the body at arm's length. So these observations point towards a greater need to control the body and people's interaction with it, to keep it from view but maintain it in such a way as it would retain its identity as an entire body, the body that it continued to be in the minds of the mourners, even if in reality decomposition would eventually render it unrecognisable. So perhaps we can see a sort of denial of decay, a desire to preserve bodily integrity in order for it to match up with some sort of idealised image of the dead. A recent work by my colleague at the OU, Val Hope, has identified a heightened degree of sentimentality concerning the dead within literature and epigraphy at the same period, so the later 1st and 2nd century CE. And that includes a greater emphasis on the deification of the dead, and also this idea that the dead are sleeping rather than rotting in the grave. And at the same time, we're finding this evidence that indicates a concern for the well-being of the material body in the grave. So libations that I mentioned before, they were associated with cremation burials, but they also seem to become more common in relation to inhumation graves. So this need to go and to feed and to look after the dead in the grave. And what's more, amongst the wooden coffins recovered at Ravenna, 2 were found to contain tiles and 4 contained pieces of wood, all of which were used as pillows. And wooden pillows are rare, but they probably existed in other cemeteries, because we do find evidence elsewhere for other types of pillows, such as 2 from the Via Nomentana, again close to Rome, dated to the 2nd century CE. There's possible evidence for shrouds and coffins, but also the bodies who are placed directly into the grave also sometimes seem to have been given some sort of pillow. So in 2 cases they were made from pieces of stone that was placed at the head of the grave, and in further 5 cases a tile was used as a pillow. And at least 5 graves at Vagneri in Puglia in the south of Italy had imbrecs, so curved roof tiles sort of used as headrests, and in 2 tiles were also laid down to create almost like a bed for the body. We do get pillows elsewhere in other cemeteries, and I think even when there isn't evidence for them, we might suggest that perhaps actual pillows may have been used. So aside from the libation facilities, which have some kind of ritual purposes, features like pillows don't really serve any kind of religious, ritual, social function. They seem to be entirely associated with the welfare of the body. They might have been used to sort of prop the head up of the dead to make them appear slightly more alive, to give the impression that they were sleeping by preventing the head from sort of lolling backwards and looking as lifeless as it really was. Pillows are not relevant in instances of cremation, but neither are they really essential for inhumation. You can put a body in a grave without one. So instead, they seem to suggest that choices are being made on an individual level to place these bodies in the ground with particular care. So there are definitely changes in Roman burial practice from the 1st century CE, and the factors that influenced the end of one practice and the start of another, I think, are quite complex and multifaceted. But I suggest that this is about more than just deciding to put the dead in a box instead of on a pyre. And I think what we see at this time is the beginning and the ending of particular attitudes towards the treatment of the dead body, including a new desire to ensure adequate, sometimes more than adequate, protection for it, and to keep it increasingly away from view. I think we also see the end of the cultural acceptance that it should be violently destroyed. So the integrity of the body, as I say, seems to have gained special significance at this time. Through inhumation and the use of particular strategies, the people of Rome and Italy began to create an idealized and sentimentalized body with which they could continue to interact during ongoing memory activities when they returned on regular occasions to the cemetery to make use of these libation facilities. So in the arena of Roman death, I think we can see that the origins and the endings of funerary practices were entwined and mixed up with the origins and endings of some very real, very human relationships between the living and the dead. Thank you.
Italians have a special relationship with their dead, in the sense that the commemoration of death is fundamental to an Italian sense of identity, community, even nationhood. This bond between the Italians and their dead can be seen to endure from antiquity until today. So my talk will continue our journey in the company of the dead through Italian history, bringing us into the modern period. In the 19th century, vast monumental cemeteries were built in cities and towns across Italy. While these cemeteries perpetuated long-standing traditions in commemoration, they were also a novelty. They represented a new way of burying the dead that emerged as a direct result of changes in Italian society and politics. As seen at the Island Cemetery in Venice, still possessed, Italy's monumental cemeteries are unique among European burial sites in their scale and grandeur. They were the result of a radical reform in burial practices across Europe, a reform that resulted in part from the influence of the Enlightenment. So whereas in antiquity the dead were generally buried outside of cities, from the Middle Ages they were interred in churches and churchyards inside cities. It was not until the early 1800s that Napoleon prohibited burial within cities, in Italy as in much of Europe. This reform resulted from the Enlightenment and from a new understanding of the dangers presented by contagion from rotting corpses. But it was also a response to the Enlightenment and to calls for more intimate and personal forms of remembrance. As a result of Napoleon's reforms, new cemeteries were built on the outskirts of many European cities. Italy in particular saw an intense period of cemetery building, as over the course of the 19th century, most major Italian cities acquired one or more suburban cemeteries. These were radically different from earlier graveyards in that they were modern, secular, multi-denominational, and they were built by the municipality rather than by the church. As products of modernity, they had little precedent in earlier traditions. And given this lack of an obvious model, their architecture reflected the social and political developments that brought them into being. In fact, Italy's new cemeteries were different not only from earlier graveyards, but also from their European counterparts. In the 19th century, much of Europe adopted the model of the garden cemetery as seen at Père Lachaise in Paris. But Italy rejected the picturesque landscape and developed its own distinctive format. Italy's monumental cemeteries were architectural rather than landscaped, with elevated tombs rather than graves in the ground, and they were made of an axial layout with avenues, major buildings, and avenues. What really set Italian cemeteries apart from other European burial sites was their scale and their monumentality. So the question is, why did Italians go to great effort to build these massive burial sites? Why did they develop their own specific type of cemetery? Well, there are two sets of factors, one social and one political. Let's look first at the social factors. Cemeteries mirror the societies that they serve. This is because differences in wealth and power are reflected in the scale, prominence, and location of tombs within a cemetery. The fact that the tombs of the wealthy and the powerful will be larger and more prominently located. So class divisions within Italian cities were reflected in their cemeteries, in that the lower classes were buried in cramped flats, while the rich were accommodated in large villas. In the 19th century, Italy saw significant social change with the rise of the middle classes, change which had a marked impact on their cemeteries. So generally, before the modern reformation of burial, the aristocracy were buried in chapels, in churches, while the poor were located in the surrounding graveyard. the middle classes were largely excluded from funerary art. The new cemeteries offered a growing bourgeoisie a chance to create their own family tombs. So this rising social group adopted the burial sites as platforms for their newfound status. This is how these cemeteries came to be dominated by the aspirations and self-aggrandizement of the new bourgeoisie. So wealthy businessmen built multi-storied villas as their tombs, while newly enriched professionals opted for their own Egyptian pyramids. For a rising middle class, the new cemeteries were also places for frequent visits. The Sunday passeggiata, or stroll through the tombs, was an occasion to remember the dead, but also to see and to be seen. So much so that regulation was needed to stop the visitors from using the tomb slabs as picnic tables. So in this sense, the cemeteries were like public parks and opera houses as new spaces of 19th century cities that responded to a demand on the part of a new social group to represent itself and to socialize. The influence of the middle classes was such that it led to the development of a new style of funerary sculpture. This style is called bourgeois realism because it emerged in the mid-1800s to satisfy a bourgeoisie that demanded a more realistic form of funerary art in order to represent its status and wealth. The main novelty of this style is that earlier classical sculpture depicted ancient or Christian symbols. So on the left, we have a personification of knowledge in classical dress. But as seen on the right, the key difference in the new bourgeois realist sculpture is that figures from real life take the place occupied by allegorical figures. So instead of a personification of knowledge or another virtue, we find the widow of the dead. The figures depicted in bourgeois realist sculpture are often relatives of the deceased. In many cases, they are shown as if on a visit to the dead. So you can see here how the mother lifts up the child to kiss the bust of the dead grandmother. And this representation of relatives reflects the importance of the family as a foundation of bourgeois society. It is important that the figures are depicted in contemporary dress rather than in classical garments, because this allowed for the exhibition of wealth through the highly detailed depiction of expensive clothing, clothing which often reflected the very latest fashions in mourning clothes. You can see the intricacy of this lace. It's also significant that within bourgeois realist sculpture, symbols from classical and Christian traditions took on new associations. For instance, the weighing scales traditionally refers to the Last Judgment, but here denotes the tomb of a lawyer. Traditional symbols also take on meanings relating to real life. For instance, there are many attributes that refer to the profession of the dead. You can see here a measuring tape and a T-square indicate the tomb of an architect. And the abundance of references to profession points to the value of work as a defining characteristic of bourgeois identity. In earlier funerary monuments, it was common to include an allegory of charity. But this subtle allusion to the virtues of the dead is made much more explicit in bourgeois realist sculpture, either by including beggars or by showing the patrons themselves giving alms to the poor. So like work and family, charity is represented as a key element of bourgeois morality. And this shows how funerary sculpture performed a range of social functions, as it served an emergent social group as a way to display their wealth and status, but also to represent themselves and their values. Another way in which the Italian elites could project their self-image was through photography. And in turn, the early developments of photography influenced the form of sculpture. This can be seen in sculptures that resemble photographs, in the highly detailed and realistic representation of families posing within interiors. The influence of photography can also be seen in sculptures representing the deathbed. Now, the moment of death was important in the 19th century, as how you died was seen as a measure of success for an entire life. And as represented in these deathbed scenes, the ideal way to die is at home surrounded by a large family. At the same time, the dramatic poses adopted in the deathbed scenes point to the influence of Italian opera. Deathbed scenes took on a more sinister character towards the end of the 19th century as the Italian elites entered a period of social and economic crisis. This was reflected in morbid and macabre representations of death, for instance, in the many sculptures that depict l'ultimo bacio, the last kiss given to a dead spouse. Some of these sculptures also seem to eroticize death and to highlight the connections between Eros and Thanatos. But social change and the rise of the middle classes were common forces throughout 19th century Europe, so they cannot fully explain why the monumental cemetery was distinctive of Italy. To understand the unique nature of Italian cemeteries, we must turn instead to politics. In the 19th century, Italy underwent a period of turbulent political change. For centuries, the nation had been divided among many states under different rulers. But the Risorgimento, or the struggle for independence, eventually led to Italian unification in 1861. The cemeteries built over the course of the 1800s became caught up in the politics of the Risorgimento. Through their monumental architecture, they expressed nationalism and civic pride. After unification, they were also used to build a national history and identity. The most obvious way in which the cemeteries were implicated in the politics of unification was through the commemoration of national heroes. The new burial grounds offered an ideal stage to celebrate patriots. So in cemeteries across Italy, lavish tombs were built with public funds for those who fought for Italian freedom. This often meant exhuming those who had died before unification. At the Verano Cemetery in Rome, after the city was conquered in 1870, national heroes were reburied in new tombs. For instance, the patriot Cesare Lucatelli had been decapitated by the papal authorities for his revolutionary activities. And here he is represented as the martyred St. John the Baptist with his head on a tray. Also at the Verano in Rome, we find Goffredo Mameli, the author of the text of Italy's national anthem, Fratelli d'Italia. Mameli represents the romantic ideal of the warrior poet. He died fighting to free Rome in 1849 at only 22 years of age. He was exhumed some 40 years later from his initial burial site within a Roman church and reburied in the monumental cemetery. These tombs were meant to foster a sense of unity through a shared memory of national heroes. In addition, most monumental cemeteries have at their center a pantheon. This is a secular temple dedicated to the memory of national heroes. The tradition of the pantheon emerged across 18th century Europe with the rise of modern nationalism. Examples include Westminster Abbey, the Pantheon in Paris, the Valhalla near Regensburg in Germany. The name, of course, comes from the ancient Pantheon in Rome, which had been used for the burial of artists since the Renaissance. As honorable places of burial, pantheons became widespread during the fight for independence in Italy and continued to be built after unification as a way to foster national pride. As a result, most major Italian cities have a pantheon dedicated to the memory of local and national heroes. As you can see at Genova, some of these modern pantheons replicate the dome and the cylindrical form of the original pantheon in Rome. Here are the interiors of the pantheons in the monumental cemeteries of Milan and Pavia. And you can see how the walls are lined with plaques dedicated to the memory of heroes. Heroes who are often buried elsewhere. One contemporary source compared this arrangement to the pages of a history book for the citizens of the new nation. Of course, the objective was to construct a national history through the memory of the dead to bring together this new nation. It's worth remembering that Italy was unified from a patchwork of regions with their own distinct identities. So as a result, the nation was deeply fragmented and to some extent remains so today. In this sense, the pantheons were part of a wider campaign to bring together a divided nation. Another way to express political change was through architectural style. Italian unification had an immediate impact on the styles used in the architecture of cemeteries. Before independence, cemeteries were built predominantly, if not exclusively, in a neoclassical style. For example, the cemetery at Brescia near Milan is steeped in references to antiquity. The lining of the tombs along an avenue hints to the ancient Roman Via Appia, or Appian Way. At the center of the cemetery stands a 60-meter tall Doric column, which is a reference to the ancient lighthouse at Alexandria. The column was designed by the architect of the cemetery for his own family. So it's a remarkable example of the megalomania of architects. The dominance of classicism within Italian cemeteries was brought to an abrupt end by Italian unification. In the three cities of Milan, Pavia, and Padua, construction was underway to build cemeteries in a classical style when the cities were liberated from their Austrian rulers. As soon as the cities were freed, work on the cemeteries was interrupted. The newly appointed authorities decided to abandon the ongoing projects because their classical style was seen to be tainted by associations with foreign oppression. Instead, they decided to build new projects in medieval styles as a way to signal regime change and their newfound freedom. To conclude, the monumental cemeteries emerged across 19th century Italy as a consequence of modernity. They reflected a period of intense social and political change connected to the rise of the middle classes and to the struggle for Italian unification. But at the same time, they show continuities in Italian history in the form of the commemoration of the dead. Following long-standing traditions, the dead continued to be remembered in the modern era, and even continued to play a role in Italian society and politics. Above all, the monumental cemeteries show how in modern Italy, the dead continued to be fellow travelers to the living. Thanks for listening.
Thank you all very much for 4 incredibly stimulating interventions where the notion of transitor as embedded within technology was overcome by our deft speakers as we rushed towards the end. I love the notion that the risorgimento literally had the sense of exhumation in terms of there's no such thing as an ending. Even when we think there's an ending, somebody else will come up with a new beginning and a new reading for us. We probably have a little bit of time for a couple of quick questions, but I'm also mindful of the fact that time is speeding on, and I would like you to join our speakers for a glass of something outside where you can ask them questions informally as well. So if we do have a couple of quick questions from the floor, and then hold any other questions we have for informal conversation afterwards. Here at the front.
I was particularly interested in the burial of the Roman dead and the thoughts on why they changed from cremation to inhumation. Another possibility is the fire risk. You restrain them, the burial practices, obviously been a lot of dangerous fires in Rome in the 1st century, and maybe laws are brought out that we haven't discovered yet, restricting the use of Eustrina, that was sort of put the kibosh on it, and the inhumation and replaced it. I don't know what your thoughts on that one are.
Grab that one, or you're going to feedback tremendously. I don't know.
Too many microphones.
Yeah.
I will become Britney Spears if I'm not careful with this one. It's a possibility. It's worth thinking about because cremation pyre can burn 600, 800 degrees for 8 hours at a time. And if you're talking about mass cremation pyres around Rome, it's quite possible. I don't think there's that much evidence for everybody being cremated. I think the poor, for example, probably already were buried inhumed anyway.
Cheaper.
Just one more point was, and you covered one point, cost, of course, much more expensive than inhumation when it comes to the sort of funeral dirge and everything. But the other just point is smoke nuisance. I mean, pollution, there may be anti-pollution laws because obviously the smoke is pretty toxic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's going to be pretty nasty. I don't know of any laws that talk about that. I don't know whether anyone else here does. I'm sort of looking at Maureen over there as another fellow Roman death person, but I'm not. We love a dead body. A Roman dead body. I don't know of any laws to that effect, but it would. Yeah, it's certainly a possibility. I think there is a lot going on. I mean, obviously in 20 minutes I've probably compressed it down to the thing that I'm particularly interested in, which is the body aspect of it. But there are other things going on as well. So, thank you.
One more quick one if we've got one on the floor. If not, I'm tempted to move everybody on to a glass of Prosecco, and if we could all thank our speakers for a wonderful